Blue Book is one of the most controversial military projects in US history, from unexplained sightings to highly questionable cover-ups. Today we're going to dive into the real story behind Project Blue Book and the government's quest to unravel the UFO phenomenon, and then cover it all up. Project Blue Book was an official investigation conducted by the United States Air Force from March of 1952 to December of 1969. It stemmed from similar projects, Sign and Project Grudge, but when Air Force generals leading those projects started getting fed up with how poorly UFO investigations were going, they wanted something more serious, and so Project Blue Book was born. Its main goal was to look into and analyze reports of unidentified flying objects to see if they posed any real threat to national security. This project came about during a time when UFO sightings were starting to become a lot more frequent, and people were genuinely scared at the time. I think today most people find the idea of spotting genuine UFOs and aliens kind of exciting, but the concept of aliens was relatively new at the time, or newer, and fear seemed to be the general vibe. Just look at all the alien invasion movies like War of the Worlds coming out at the time. The USAF decided to take a systematic approach to studying these sightings, attempting to separate reports that could be chalked up to natural phenomena from the cases that had no solid explanation. Project Blue Book collected over 12,000 reports of UFO sightings during its operation. The team working on it included scientists, military personnel, and other experts. By the time the project ended, most of the cases were explained, but a small percentage did remain unidentified. Cases that Project Blue Book investigated and their findings are cited in discussions about government secrecy when it comes to UFOs to this day. Project Blue Book had a very specific classification system, which was used to organize and analyze the thousands of UFO reports that the US Air Force was receiving. The system was important to help make sense of the data and determine which cases deserved some deeper investigation. The sightings were categorized into three main groups: identified, insufficient information, and unidentified. The identified category is pretty self-explanatory. These were sightings that could be easily explained. They usually turned out to be misidentified aircraft, weather balloons, other natural phenomena like lightning. The insufficient information category included cases where there wasn't enough data to make a solid judgment. Reports like this were sometimes incomplete or just lacking in detail, making it tough for them to draw any solid conclusions. And then you have the exciting category: unidentified. These were for cases that couldn't be explained. They made up a small percentage of the total reports, but that's not really surprising. People didn't know as much about what went on up in the sky then, and with the UFO craze at its peak, people were making a lot of reports that we'd probably never bother making today. Project Blue Book was first headed by United States Air Force officer Edward James Ruppelt. If Project Blue Book was a TV show, this first season was the best. Ruppelt seemed to have a genuine interest in actually uncovering the truth behind these UFO reports. Ruppelt was an experienced airman and had served in World War II. He was also responsible for coining the term unidentified flying object. Before that, they were just known as flying saucers. He'd made a lot of changes to how UFO reports were handled. He set out to reduce the stigma that often came with reporting a UFO, creating a standard questionnaire for UFO witnesses. This would also help gather data that could be analyzed statistically. Ruppelt took his job very seriously and expected the same from his team. He avoided speculation and made sure his staff didn't lean too heavily towards any single theory about UFOs. If anyone was too skeptical or too convinced, they were off the project. He also went to scientists for advice, issued regular press releases, and kept the military up to date with monthly reports. Some of the biggest cases during Ruppelt's time included the Lubbock Lights and a 1952 radar visual sighting over Washington, D.C. The scientific consultant for Blue Book was an astronomer named J. Allen Hynek. He'd been skeptical about the project at first, but he started to become more open to the idea of UFOs as he encountered more and more reports. More on him later. Ruppelt left Project Blue Book in February of 1953 for a temporary reassignment. When he returned, though, he found his team had been cut down significantly. he ended up losing faith in the project and left. His time with Project Blue Book is remembered as the last serious attempt by the Air Force to genuinely analyze UFO phenomena. 1953 is where things really started to go downhill, and a lot of that is thanks to the Robertson Panel. UFO sightings were on the rise, especially around Washington, D.C., so this led to a lot of attention and concern. So the CIA decided to set up a panel of scientists to look into it. This group, called the Robertson Panel, was led by H.P. Robertson, a physicist from the California Institute of Technology. The panel included physicists, meteorologists, engineers, and one astronomer, J. Allen Hynek. The Robertson Panel first met on January 14th of 1953. They wanted to figure out how to handle the growing public interest in UFOs. Captain Edward J. Ruppelt, Hynek, and others presented the best evidence they'd gathered. After 12 hours of reviewing 6 years worth of data, the panel concluded that most UFO sightings had simple explanations, and all could be explained with more investigation, which they didn't think was worth the effort. The panel believed that these unverifiable UFO reports were just clogging things up, risking the chance of missing a real threat to the United States. So they recommended that the Air Force downplay the importance of UFOs and start a full-on debunking campaign. They suggested using mass media, even getting Disney involved, and enlisting celebrities to treat the subject like a joke in order to make the whole subject seem less serious and interesting to the public. Then in December of '53, a regulation was put in place, making it a crime for military personnel to discuss classified UFO reports with unauthorized people. So this panel right here really shaped how UFOs and alien reports would be dealt with in the years to come. In March of 1954, Captain Charles Hardin took over Project Blue Book, and he basically treated his whole time there as a lunch break. He had very little interest in UFOs and was pretty hands-off. The previous head of the project, Edward James Ruppelt, really wasn't a fan of this guy, writing that Hardin, quote, thinks that anyone who is even interested in UFOs is crazy. They bore him. During this time, the number of reports deemed unidentified had dropped to less than 1%. During the Ruppelt era, this category made up about 20 to 25% of all reports. The debunking campaign was clearly in full effect here. Captain Hardin was mostly just disinterested in the whole thing, but Captain Gregory, who came next, he was even worse, in that he was actively setting out to downplay and discredit pretty much every UFO report he came across. Captain George T. Gregory took over Project Blue Book in 1956. They now wanted as few unidentified reports as possible, so they changed how they classified these sightings. Gregory's approach to this was pretty straightforward. He reclassified many of the UFO sightings to make them fit with more conventional explanations. For example, if a sighting was labeled as a possible comet, it was bumped up to a probable comet. And if a sighting had been previously labeled as a probable comet, well, that just became a definite 100% misidentified comet. This same method applied to other sightings, like balloons. If someone reported seeing a strange balloon-like object, Blue Book would just call it a balloon without doing much, if any, research. This tactic became standard practice into the later years of Blue Book. This wasn't cool. Even the scientific consultant for Blue Book, J. Allen Hynek, who I mentioned before, a guy that had been such a hard skeptic at first, even he thought this was wrong. Everything was looking pretty bleak. It seemed like Project Blue Book had jumped the shark. Ratings were down, the show was on the verge of being cancelled. But then a new star of the show came along. Lieutenant Colonel Robert J. Friend took over Project Blue Book in 1958. Unlike Gregory, Friend tried to change things up and steer Blue Book back toward serious UFO investigations, but he faced a lot of challenges. There was a serious lack of funding and support. The higher-ups still wanted these things to be downplayed. But Hynek saw Friend as a breath of fresh air and rallied behind him. He organized a meeting in 1959 between Blue Book staff and personnel from the Air Technical Intelligence Center, or the ATIC. Or do people say ATIC? I imagine They say attic, but who knows? You tell me. Hynek figured it was time to reevaluate some older UFO reports, but these plans didn't go very far. During Friend's time, there were talks about moving Blue Book to another Air Force agency, but no one else wanted to take it on. In 1960, the US Congress held hearings about UFOs. The civilian UFO research group NICAP accused Blue Book of covering up UFO evidence and gained some allies in Congress. Because of this, Blue Book was investigated by Congress and the CIA, with folks saying they hadn't been doing what they were supposed to be doing, genuine scientific studies. Some more personnel were added, and Blue Book's budget was increased. Things looked like they were on the up and up, but it seemed like it had all been for show. By the time Friend left Blue Book in 1963, he'd become very disillusioned with the project. He figured it had become ineffective and should be dissolved. He tried so hard and got so far, but in the end, it didn't even matter. He couldn't turn Project Blue Book into what it was in the glory days of Edward Ruppelt. After that, Major Hector Quintanilla took over and ran the whole project straight into the ground, fully embracing the debunking campaign that had been plaguing the project for years. Now, of course, there are endless conspiracies surrounding Project Blue Book and the project's handling of UFO cases, especially for the post-Ruppelt era, where the leaders seemed to be less open to the possibility of UFOs on the surface. Were they genuinely dismissive, or were they hiding things? A lot of people who are into UFOs, or just skeptical folks in general, think that Project Blue Book dismissed credible UFO reports without proper investigation, and that they were trying to debunk rather than seriously study the possibility of UFO phenomena and aliens. When Project Blue Book ended in 1969, the Air Force made several statements about their findings over the years. They claimed that most UFO sightings could be explained by identifiable objects or natural phenomena. This included everything from weather balloons and aircraft to stars and clouds. They stated that these objects posed no threat to national security and that there was no evidence suggesting that any sightings were related to extraterrestrial beings or advanced technology beyond what was known at the time. Basically, their final report downplayed the possibility of UFOs being anything extraordinary. But as I said, not everyone was convinced, and there have been conspiracies ever since. So much of the discussions around government cover-ups when it comes to aliens and UFOs comes from Project Blue Book. Some former military personnel and insiders have come forward over the years claiming that there were cases of more detailed investigations and findings that were never made public. But why did Project Blue Book, especially in the later years, seem to have this agenda of dismissing the idea of extraterrestrials and downplaying credible reports? Well, aside from that whole clogging up the pipes thing that I mentioned earlier, most people will say it was to avoid panic in the public. Maybe the government thought and still think that we're just not ready to hear that there really are little green alien folk flying around our planet. Maybe the government is actually working with them, and to avoid public outrage, they're keeping it quiet. But there's another possibility that's a lot more depressing, so why don't we finish off with that? Some argue that Project Blue Book and projects similar to it that have followed in its footsteps are really just smokescreens designed to give the appearance of transparency while actually diverting our attention away from darker government activity. This is the thing none of us really want to believe. It's a lot less fun, but it is possible. As for what they could be hiding, you name it. Everything from testing of dangerous weapons to more conspiratorial stuff like weather control. There are all kinds of possibilities, and none of them are all that pleasant. But I like to think that there are aliens visiting Earth, that we're on the verge of an exciting new chapter in history. Hey, one can dream, right? With all that said, what do you think of Project Blue Book and projects like it? Leave your comments down below, and I will catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.